You've seen Richard Jaeckel 100 times, even if you never knew his name. He stood beside giants, delivered lines that carried more truth than most leading roles, and then vanished from the industry without a sound. His decline wasn't marked by scandal or disgrace. It was marked by something quieter and far more unsettling. How does a man who spent 50 years holding Hollywood together end up forgotten by the very world he served? The answer is tragic, deeply human, and more painful than anyone expected. The invisible icon. Richard Jaeckel belonged to a rare category of actors, the kind whose face became familiar long before anyone bothered to learn his name. For more than 50 years, he appeared in the background of America's most enduring war films, westerns, police dramas, and even hit television shows. His eyes carried a mix of exhaustion and alertness, a lived-in realism that made audiences believe every role he touched. He wasn't cast to charm or dazzle. He was cast because he felt real, because he grounded stories in a way that few actors could. Hollywood relied on him constantly, yet it never elevated him. He became the man audiences recognized instantly, but could never quite identify by name. Throughout the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, this pattern defined his life. Leading men drew the attention, but Jaeckel was the quiet force making the scenes believable. He was the soldier who looked like he had actually heard gunfire, the sheriff who felt like he had really walked dusty streets, the companion whose presence gave the hero's journey emotional weight. And ironically, the very thing that made him so authentic, his ability to disappear into characters, became the reason his name faded from public memory. Viewers remembered the character, not the actor. He blended in too well, performed too honestly, and never tried to pull the spotlight toward himself. Hollywood marketing didn't help. Even in films where his performance carried major emotional weight, like The Dirty Dozen or sometimes A Great Notion, his presence was pushed to the background on posters, trailers, and promotional material. His Oscar-nominated performance in 1971 should have changed that narrative, but studios still treated him like a dependable supporting player rather than an asset worth celebrating. While stars hired publicists and shaped their images, Jaeckel stayed quiet. He didn't chase interviews, magazine covers, or controversy. He let the work speak for itself, and in Hollywood, silence rarely gets rewarded. Yet audiences felt him. Even when they couldn't name him, they sensed his honesty, his toughness, his humanity. Richard Jaeckel may never have been a headline actor, but he was the thread woven through the fabric of classic American cinema. And the tragedy is that while Hollywood depended on him, it never truly saw him. Breaking into Hollywood without trying. Richard Jaeckel did not enter Hollywood the way most actors dream of. There were no drama classes, no prestigious theater schools, no family connections to open doors. His path began in 1943 when he was just 17, working as a mailboy at 20th Century Fox after his family moved from Long Beach, New York to Los Angeles. The job paid barely enough to cover basic expenses, $18 a week, roughly equivalent to $280 today, but it placed him inside a studio at the exact moment Hollywood was expanding faster than ever during World War II. Jaeckel wasn't chasing fame. He was simply delivering envelopes across a massive studio lot, moving between producers, directors, and actors without expecting anything more than a steady paycheck. Then fate intervened. One morning, while delivering mail to the casting department, he walked in at the precise moment director Louis Sealer and screenwriter Lamar Trotty were searching for teenage boys to play Marines in a new war film, Guadalcanal Diary. Jaeckel's wiry frame, serious expression, and quiet intensity caught their attention immediately. He looked like a real soldier, not polished, not glamorous, but authentic. Within minutes, he was offered a screen test. 3 days later, after a 15-minute audition, he was cast as Private Frankie Benson. For 6 weeks of filming, he earned $750, more money than 10 months of running letters across the Fox lot. And with that, His career began unexpectedly. But instead of taking advantage of his momentum, he made a decision that would have derailed most rising actors. He enlisted in the military in 1944, just 1 year after earning his first major role. He served until 1948, choosing duty over Hollywood at a time when war films were becoming increasingly popular. When he returned, many of his peers had gained fame, contacts, and leading roles. He had to start again almost from scratch. Still, his military experience gave him something priceless on screen: authenticity. When he appeared in Sands of Iwo Jima alongside John Wayne, audiences believed him because he wasn't pretending to understand the battlefield. He had lived it. That realism became his trademark, and directors began relying on him for roles that needed weight and credibility. He wasn't trained, but he was true. And in many ways, that made him irreplaceable. The Rise, the Oscar nomination, and the trap of typecasting. By the 1950s and 60s, Richard Jaeckel had become one of Hollywood's most reliable supporting actors. So reliable, in fact, that studios began to depend on him for roles requiring grit, tension, and realism. Between 1949 and 1952 alone, he appeared in Battleground, City Across the River, Wyoming Mail, and The Gunfighter. In that last film, he had only a single scene, playing a cocky young gunslinger who dies in a duel with Gregory Peck. The moment was brief, but unforgettable. It showed his natural talent, and it also revealed the trap closing around him. He was too good at playing rugged soldiers, cowboys, and blue-collar men. Studios recognized this instantly, and instead of building him into a leading man, they repeatedly cast him in variations of the same character. Still, he pushed against those limits when he could. In 1952, he portrayed Turk in Come Back, Little Sheba, a flirtatious, athletic young man pursuing Terry Moore's character. It was the opposite of his usual roles, and critics praised him for it. The New York Times singled him out for his surprisingly bold performance, but Hollywood didn't change. No matter how much he proved he could stretch beyond the uniform, producers continued to place him back into the same mold. Dependable, gritty, secondary, essential, but never central. Then came 1967 and The Dirty Dozen, the film that would anchor his legacy. As Sergeant Clyde Bowen, the no-nonsense military police officer assigned to train the infamous group of criminals, Jaeckel delivered one of his most memorable performances. He wasn't the loudest character, but he was the one who made the mission feel real. When he read off the prisoners' sentences with cold precision, death by hanging, audiences felt the weight of every word. The film was a massive hit, earning him $200,000, a huge sum for a character actor in the 1960s. Yet despite the film's success, Hollywood still didn't push him into leading roles. His greatest artistic breakthrough came shortly after. In 1971, Paul Newman personally chose him for Sometimes a Great Notion after seeing him playing with his children on Malibu Beach. Newman saw vulnerability beneath the toughness, something deeper than studios had ever recognized. Jaeckel's portrayal of Joe Ben Stamper, a man drowning emotionally and physically, earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor. It was the moment that should have redefined his career. But it didn't. The phone didn't suddenly ring more. No major roles arrived. He went right back to the grind, because even with an Oscar nomination, Hollywood still saw him as the reliable guy, not the star. Television, family pain, and the long, quiet decline. As the film industry shifted through the 1970s and 80s, Richard Jaeckel quietly adapted. When Hollywood began leaning toward younger faces and flashier storytelling, he turned increasingly to television, not as a fallback, but as another place where he could anchor stories with his unshakable realism. He appeared in Frontier Circus, Banyan, Firehouse, Salvage One, At Ease, and eventually Baywatch from 1991 to 1994. These shows rarely lasted more than 1 or 2 seasons, yet Jaeckel always stood out. Directors trusted him. Producers kept rehiring him. Even when he appeared for only an episode or two, his characters felt like they had lived full lives before the camera started rolling. But behind this relentless work ethic was a man carrying years of quiet, personal pain. In 1948, while visiting San Francisco, his 14-month-old son slipped into a swimming pool and nearly drowned. He was rescued in the final moments by Jaeckel's uncle, a moment that left the actor shaken for life. He became fiercely protective of his family afterward, coaching Little League in West Los Angeles, keeping his household grounded even as film schedules consumed him. While other actors disappeared into nightlife and fame, Jaeckel hurried home between shoots. Then came the blow that reshaped his final years. His wife, Antoinette, whom he had married in 1947, began showing signs of Alzheimer's disease. By the early 1990s, her memory was fading rapidly. As Richard's career slowed, her condition worsened. The woman who had stood beside him through decades of long workdays, studio politics, and financial instability could no longer remember the life they built together. And this unfolded at the very moment he needed her most. Hollywood's changing landscape didn't help. By the late 80s and early 90s, studios were prioritizing special effects, brand-driven franchises, and celebrity image. Character-driven roles, the ones Jaeckel excelled at, were fading. Younger, more marketable actors filled the screens. Directors who once depended on his grounding presence were now instructed to choose faces that looked good on posters. His roles became smaller. The phone rang less often. For the first time since 1943, work was no longer guaranteed. And then came the diagnosis that ended everything. In 1994, at age 68, Richard Jaeckel learned he had advanced melanoma, caused not by cigarettes or poor habits, but by a lifetime of surfing shirtless under the California sun. His health began to fail, just as Hollywood's memory of him did. Bankruptcy, loss, and Hollywood's cruel silence. By the early 1990s, Richard Jaeckel was facing a crisis no one could have predicted, not after 50 years of steady work, more than 150 roles, and a reputation as one of Hollywood's most dependable actors. The first blow came quietly. The roles dried up. Not because he had failed, but because the industry had changed. Casting directors now prioritized publicity value over experience, marketability over authenticity. Actors who had half his talent but twice his visibility were getting the parts, and for a man who never built a brand, the shift was devastating. Then came the medical bills. After his melanoma diagnosis in 1994, Richard simply could not work consistently. The disease progressed fast, stripping away the physical strength that had defined him on screen. Costs mounted rapidly, treatments, hospital visits, medications, and there was no financial safety net waiting for him. Despite a career spanning 5 decades, he never earned the kind of money people assumed. His income had been steady but modest, spread across countless supporting roles rather than starring contracts. There were no major endorsements, no syndication wealth, no real estate empire behind him. By the time he turned 67, the situation became unmanageable. In 1994, Richard Jaeckel filed for personal bankruptcy. The number was shocking, even to those who knew him well. $1.7 million in debt. Everything he had built was suddenly wiped away. His Brentwood home, one of the few luxuries he had allowed himself, was taken. Furniture, memorabilia, awards, and personal items accumulated across half a century of work were sold off to pay creditors. This wasn't a graceful retirement or a quiet downsizing, it was a collapse. And just when he needed emotional support most, the cruelest twist arrived. His wife, Antoinette, his partner since 1947, was deep into Alzheimer's, unable to remember their life together. The woman who had celebrated his early roles comforted him during setbacks and watched him rise from a mail boy to an Oscar-nominated actor, now no longer recognized him. Richard, facing the financial and physical battle of his life, faced it alone. Hollywood offered no help, no tribute, no campaign to support a veteran actor. The same industry that once relied on his face to sell realism didn't even issue a statement. It simply moved on as if he had never existed, and for Richard Jaeckel, that silence hurt more than the debts or the diagnosis. Final days, quiet support, and a legacy without applause. After filing for bankruptcy and losing his home, Richard Jaeckel moved in 1994 into the Motion Picture and Television Fund home in Woodland Hills, a place created for industry veterans who had fallen on hard times. It was a safe, dignified environment. But for Jaeckel, it represented something heartbreaking: the end of independence for a man who had worked every year since he was 17. At the same time, his health declined rapidly. Melanoma spread, taking his strength and slowly dimming the sharp focus he once brought to every role. The man who had carried so many stories on his shoulders could now barely stand without assistance. Yet even in this quiet, painful chapter, he was not entirely alone. Gregory Peck, one of Hollywood's most respected icons, personally intervened to help secure his place at the facility. The staff treated him with respect. And then, something unexpected began to happen. While the studios stayed silent, everyday people did not. Fans who had grown up watching him in The Dirty Dozen, Sands of Iwo Jima, or his countless westerns sent handwritten letters, small donations, and messages filled with gratitude. Former co-stars quietly chipped in to ease his financial strain. There were no red carpets, no televised fundraisers, no media attention, just quiet kindness from those who truly remembered him. Meanwhile, Antoinette, the woman he had loved since 1947, remained alive but unreachable, locked away by Alzheimer's. Richard visited her as much as he could. Sometimes she smiled at him with a vague sense of familiarity. Often, she didn't. To a man defined by loyalty, this was a grief deeper than his cancer. He had survived Hollywood's indifference, decades of typecasting, financial ruin, but watching his wife forget him was the wound he never recovered from. On June 14, 1997, Richard Jaeckel died at age 70. His passing generated only brief mentions in trade papers. No major tributes, no retrospectives, no award show memorial slides. A man who had appeared in more than 150 films and television episodes, earned an Oscar nomination, and shaped the realism of American cinema for half a century, left the world with barely a whisper. But his real legacy didn't vanish. Fans continued discussing his films on early internet forums. Late-night TV reruns reintroduced him to new generations. Directors who valued authenticity still spoke his name with respect. Richard Jaeckel did not get applause in the end, but he left behind something more enduring: truth, honesty, and performances so real that audiences believed every second. If Richard Jaeckel ever left an impression on you, which role do you remember him from the most? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out the next video for more untold stories of Hollywood's forgotten legends.